Sharon was born in Australia, but now lives in the UK, and she's worked across 6 continents. Importantly, Sharon is the author of the 3 Barriers to Women's Career Progression. This is the model with which we'll be covering today, and it's been created from extensive research. Now, before I pass on to Sharon, I know there's still a number of people joining us, Sharon, just to warn you, you're very popular. Can people please add any comments into the chat as Sharon's talking, but also any questions, if you could put those specifically in the Q&A section, we'd really appreciate that. We're going to allow time for answering questions at the end. So please do ask as many questions as possible. We'll try and address as many as we can in the webinar today. And I'm going to now pass over to Sharon, who will take us through her findings. Thank you, Sharon.
Fabulous. And thank you very much, Aleri, for that lovely introduction. And thank you, everyone, for joining today. It's great to have you here. So today, I'm going to cover 4 things with you. I'm going to start in a moment with a quick look at the current state of gender equality around the world. And then I'm going to, in short order, get your input on the 3 most common perspectives we hear when it comes to gender equality. So we'll get your views on what's really going on. I'll then share our research on our 3 barriers model, the barriers that women face. And the research that I'll share is a combination of literature reviews that we've done and also a survey we conducted of 2,350 women. And then I'm going to finish with some solutions, that all-important part of what can we do to make things different. Now, as Aleri said, we will have time at the end for questions. So if you've got questions, please type them in the Q&A box, not the chat, but the Q&A box as we go, and we'll get through as many as we can at the end of the session. Now, there are 2 points I want to make before we get going in earnest, 2 really important points. And the first is that I'm going to share my research around why women are less represented at the top of organisations. And in doing that, I'm going to draw on data and I'm going to refer to men and women. But I am fully aware that gender is not a binary construct. It's much more fluid than that. The reality is the data that I'm going to be drawing on from other research studies from around the world at the moment is heavily geared towards cisgendered research subjects. So in other words, people whose gender identity matches their birth sex. There's very little research available on the non-binary community. Where we have it, I'll share it, but excuse me as I talk in binary terms about men and women. The second point I want to make is, as with any research findings, the findings hold true at a macro level or at an aggregate level, but they don't always hold true in every case at an individual level. So there will always be individuals for whom the research that I share today doesn't hold true, and that's okay. So without any further ado, let's get going. And I'm going to start with the concept of the leaky pipeline. So think for a moment, imagine yourself going into your kitchen to pour yourself a glass of water from the tap. The water that's coming out of that tap has flown through a number of pipes to get there. If any of those pipes are not sealed properly or broken, there will be leaks in the pipeline. And this is an analogy that we use for women in leadership. So while in many places around the world, women and men start their careers in roughly equal numbers, at every successive level of the leadership pipeline, women's representation declines. So women are leaking out of that pipeline. So women's representation at the top, at the most senior levels of organisations, is very low around the world. And so depending on where you are in the world, men are 4 times more likely than a woman who starts her career at the same time to make it to an executive committee role. And according to the UN, we're about 140 years away from solving this problem. So in other words, the current pace of change, we're about 4 or 5 generations away from getting to gender parity at managerial level around the world. So that means that not even your grandchildren's grandchildren will get to experience gender equal management in their lifetime, unless we do something to speed this up and accelerate the pace of change. Now, we've had some headwinds here because COVID has not been kind to us. The pandemic very sadly has exacerbated some of this problem and really set us back. We know that around the world through the pandemic, more women than men lost jobs. 5% of women versus 3.9% of men lost their jobs through the pandemic globally. And of course, the double burden of paid work and the unpaid domestic load fell disproportionately to women who took up most of the caring and homeschooling roles during the pandemic. So as a result, there's been greater stress, greater job instability, which has set gender equality back. So it's a pretty kind of sobering place to start this conversation. But there are reasons for optimism and there are reasons to be hopeful. And I want to share a couple of those with you. There is a very clear business case now for greater gender equality, in addition to the very obvious moral case. So we've all heard of some of the correlational studies that link better business performance with better representation of women in leadership. But a fairly recent study that came out of Australia a couple of years ago found that a 10% increase in women at key executive levels directly resulted in a 6.6% increase in the market value of the business, which for the average business is worth about $100 million. So there is a huge case to be had for thinking about strategically how we might get more women into leadership roles. What was really interesting about this study is it was more than just a correlational finding. This started to point towards causation. So a really strong case here that we're starting to see bear out in the data. Now, we also know that gender equality is not just good for business, but it is good for society, and it's good for families, and it's good for men. So if I point you to the work of Dr. Michael Kimmel, who is a US sociologist who studies men and masculinity, he has found that men in gender equal relationships are healthier. So they smoke less, they drink less, they're less likely to take recreational drugs, they're less likely to end up in accident and emergency, they're more likely to take health screenings on a regular basis, less likely to need to see a therapist, and they're also happier. Now, he also found that children growing up in gender equal families report higher levels of performance at school and lower levels of absenteeism. So some very compelling reasons for business and society in general to take gender equality seriously. So I'm sure you're wondering, if we're 140 years away from gender parity at managerial level, what are the reasons for this? And here's where I'd like to get your input. So we're going to bring up on screen some surveys for you, and I'd really like to hear your views. And these are on the most common perspectives that we hear around gender equality. So let's bring up the first research question, the first survey question. And you should see on screen a question which is this: out of the 4 groups listed, which groups do you think receive the most promotions? So is it men without children, women without children, men with children, or women with children? So take a moment to ponder that and answer that question. You'll see there's a little arrow which will then, once you've answered this, take you to the next question, which is the reverse. Which of these groups receive the least promotions? So men without children, women without children, men with children, or women with children. Now make sure once you've answered that, you hit submit so we can see your results. So take a moment now to share your thoughts. Which groups receive the most promotions and which groups receive the least promotions? I'll give you a moment to answer and make sure you hit submit, and then we'll have a look at the poll results. So who's getting promoted most? Who's getting promoted least? All right, let's close off that poll and see how you've responded. Having a little bit of trouble myself seeing the results. Hopefully they'll be with us in a moment. Okay, so I can see most people on the first question, which groups receive the most promotions, have said men with children. So 2/3 of you thought it was men with children who were receiving the most promotions, and 88% of you said that it was women with children receiving the least promotions. So if they were the answers that you provided, you are partly right. So what the research tells us, and this research finding comes from a study that was done by KPMG and YSC, and they asked groups of men and women who had received 5 or more promotions over the course of their career. Now, the group that had received the most promotions was men with children. So 2/3 of you selected that, men with children. So 74% of men with children said, yes, I've achieved 5 or more promotions over the course of their career. But somewhat surprisingly, the group that scored the lowest was not women with children, actually, it was women without children. So 51% of women without children reported that they had achieved 5 or more promotions over the course of their career. So that was the lowest scoring group. And it might just be worth reminding you of the point I made earlier here that research doesn't always apply at an individual level. So if you are a woman without children, it doesn't mean that you won't achieve 5 or more promotions over the course of your career. But interestingly enough, this research goes counter to what so many of us expect, because we have a belief that it is child rearing that is getting in the way of women's career progression. And it certainly plays a role. I'm going to talk about that later, but it's not the only thing that's going on here. So let me turn you now to the next poll question, if we can bring that up, please. So once again, get your fingers at the ready, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on whether this question is fact or fiction. It's a question we hear often, which goes along the lines of, or it's a statement, women these days have exactly the same opportunities as men. So what do you think? Is that fact or is that fiction? Do women have exactly the same opportunities as men? And I'm very mindful we've got people dialed in from different parts of the world. There might be some different perspectives on this. But let me know, fact or fiction? So the results are coming in thick and fast. About 2/3 of you are saying it's fiction. About a quarter of you, about 75% are saying it's fiction. About a quarter saying it's fact. So overwhelmingly, most people are saying that is fiction. So let me share what the research tells us about this. So I'm going to point to a really interesting study that was done in both the energy industry and also the healthcare industry, so 2 very different industries. And this study found that stereotype-based beliefs that women needed to be nurtured and women needed to be protected were really limiting the amount of stretch assignments and high-profile assignments that women were being offered. So sometimes we call that benevolent sexism, where a senior leader, typically a man, believes he is doing the right thing by not putting a woman forward, maybe being mindful of her personal needs or circumstances, not wanting to put her in difficult or uncomfortable positions. But the reality is, when someone else makes that decision on your behalf, it deprives you as an individual of that right and that choice. So benevolent sexism means that women aren't necessarily getting the same opportunities that might be presented to men. Now, the other thing that this research found is that when it comes to receiving feedback on performance, or feedback in performance appraisals, women receive feedback that is more vague, more personal, and less helpful than the feedback that men receive. So it makes it really difficult to know what you need to do differently. What do you need to change if the feedback isn't specific, it is vague, and if it's personal, about your personal characteristics. And then the final point I want to make on this is data that comes from the Centre for Talent Innovation, and they found that men are much more likely to be the beneficiaries of sponsorship than women. And I'm going to talk more about what sponsorship is. Sponsorship is an act of advocacy that is really important in career progression. So in answering this statement, or responding to this statement that women have exactly the same opportunities as men, I'm going to call fiction on this, because there's a lot of research that suggests that even though from a legal perspective in many countries around the world, rights are theoretically equal, the way they play out in reality is quite different across the genders. So I've got one more question for you, one more poll, and then I'm going to move on to our model. So again, let's hear your thoughts. This is a statement that I've heard many, many times, and it is, women are not as ambitious as men. What do you think? Is that a fact or is that fiction? Women are not as ambitious as men, and that's why there aren't as many women in leadership. They don't want those roles. What do you think? There's a pretty quick response coming in here, and it is overwhelmingly saying fiction. Some people saying fact, 9 people saying they think that's true. Many people saying fiction, so 90%. Now, again, let's go to the research on this. The research has found some mixed findings, actually. This is a more nuanced topic. So some research studies have found, indeed, that women are not as ambitious as men. Other research studies, on the other hand, have found at a senior level, women are more ambitious than men, but only at a senior level. And so when you've got completely different research findings, you've got to work hard to understand what's going on here, what lies beneath this, what's really going on, how have these research questions been constructed, who's been surveyed. And I think the answer is somewhere in the middle of this. So I'm going to point you to a study done by BCG, the consulting firm, and they surveyed over 200,000 employees around the world on ambition. And what they found is that at the beginning of a career, generally speaking, ambition levels don't vary significantly by gender. So men and women are about equally ambitious at the early stages of their career. But depending on the experiences a woman has over the course of her career, that ambition will either be nurtured and it will increase, or it will be diminished. So if the woman has support, if she has an encouraging line manager who encourages her to put herself forward for roles, who gives her stretch assignments, who helps her development, she is much more likely later in her career to report a higher level of ambition. Whereas if the opposite happens, the woman is much more likely to report a lower level of ambition. She just won't see it as realistic or possible to get ahead, and therefore won't feel as ambitious. And this is a really important finding because it says a lot about the importance of having good line leadership and good career development support for individuals at the early stages of their career. There's a responsibility I think we all have as leaders to make sure we are nurturing the ambition of our young talent as much as we can. All right, thank you. Thank you for your participation in those polls. So the interesting thing now is, if that doesn't explain the scenario either, what is really going on here? So I'm going to take you through what we've found. And from our research, we've identified 3 broad categories of barriers that women face in their careers. These are societal barriers, organisational barriers, and personal barriers. And within this, there are 21 underpinning sub-barriers. I won't go through all of those today, but we are going to leave you with a link to the report that goes through these in more detail if you would like to read that. So let's start with the first category, societal barriers. And these relate to the subtle and often unspoken cultural cues and references that we all receive over the course of our lifetime, which influence the way in which men and women ought to, I say that in quotations, ought to think, feel, and behave. And this in turn influences us in the workplace. Now, one of the most pervasive of these barriers is gender stereotypes. So in particular, the stereotype that men take charge and women take care. And we know from research that both men and women are prone to these gender stereotypes and judging people by this gender stereotype. And then often that's done unconsciously. We're not even aware of it. Now, societal barriers vary enormously around the world, as you're probably starting to see on screen now. They're much more prevalent in some countries and cultures. So a very clear illustration of this are the results that you see on screen, which comes from the Reykjavik Index, which is a survey that is done by the Kantar organisation. And in this particular study, they asked people in the G7 countries a very simple question. They put a statement out and asked the degree to which they agree with this statement. I would feel very comfortable with a woman as a CEO of a major company. Now here you can see that the US and the UK scored the highest, the most positive on this question. So over 2/3 of people agree. They're the highest rating countries in the survey. Might just add that there's a whopping 31 or 32% of people that are clearly not that comfortable with a woman as a CEO of a major corporation, which is worrying. But have a look at some of the other countries. So when you go to France and Italy, only 46% of the population are very comfortable with a woman as a CEO of a major corporation. And when you get to Germany and Japan, it drops even further to 39%. And so what's interesting about this is that over half of the population in some of these countries just don't really see women as natural leaders. They don't see them in leadership roles. It's particularly interesting when it comes to Germany, where, of course, there was a German woman chancellor, Angela Merkel, for 16 years. So it's a very curious finding that we see from Germany. Now, what's also interesting here is when you dissect this by gendered responses, in every single country, women answered this question more positively than men, but still not as positively as we might hope to see. So both men and women in some countries need a bit more convincing about women's leadership, suitability for leadership, but in particular, men seem to need a little bit more convincing because those scores were lower for men. So societal gender stereotypes really do run deep, and we need to bear that in mind. Now, this in turn impacts us in the home. So these gender stereotypes lead to what's called the double burden of paid and unpaid work. Now, some research that came from the UN, from the International Labour Organization, found that in heterosexual households at least, women on average perform over 3 times the amount of unpaid care work in the home as men. So 3.2 times as much unpaid care work is done by women than men. So think about that. That might be childcare, elder care, school drop-offs, cooking family dinner, and so forth. And by the way, the research on same-sex households is very different to this. That suggests there is a much more equal balance in the domestic allocation in the home. So this is very much a heterosexual phenomenon. Now, this varies again by country and culture, as I'm sure you would expect. So in the UK, for example, women do about 1.8 times the amount of unpaid care work as men. In the US, it's 1.6 times. When you get to South Africa, it's 2.3 times. Peru is 2.5 times. India is 9.5 times. It varies significantly depending on where you are in the world. But even in the Nordics, broadly understood to be the most gender equal part of the world. Even in Sweden, women are doing 1.2 times the amount of unpaid care work as men. So there is an imbalance in the home. And I always say that gender equality in the workplace starts with gender equality in the home. This double burden really matters. We need to do what we can to shift this. And the implication in the workplace is that women are more likely to progress their careers if their partner plays an active role in childcare. 21% more likely to progress their careers if their partner plays an active role in the childcare. So there is a real reason to look at how we might equalise that situation more in the home. Let's have a look now at the organisational barriers. So there's some of the societal barriers, but what's going on in organisations? And the first thing I want to draw your attention to is sponsorship. I alluded to this earlier. Many studies now have shown that women aren't lacking mentoring. What they're lacking is sponsorship. And just to be clear on the difference, if you've not heard this terminology, sponsors are people that will help you with career advancement. They're in a position of power, and they'll use that power to help raise your visibility, your profile, protect and raise your reputation. And I don't mean this in a nepotistic way. I mean in terms of giving you greater visibility so you have access to more opportunities to compete on merit. Whereas a mentor is someone who will share their knowledge with you. A sponsor is someone who will share their power on your behalf. Sometimes they're the same people, but often they're different people. Now, here's the thing. With a senior sponsor, women are just as likely as men to get promoted. But when it comes to sponsorship, men in senior roles are 50% more likely than women to have a sponsor. 50% more likely. So sponsorship is a key component for everyone in terms of advancement, but women are less likely than men to have it. And we're going to come back to this when we talk about tips. And what else is going on in the workplace? I'm going to talk to you now about everyday sexism and microaggressions. Now, this includes sexual harassment on the one end of the scale, as well as the much more subtle but equally damaging microaggressions. And if you've not heard of the term microaggressions, these are the subtle, often unintentional behaviours that can be discriminatory in isolation, but they feel very petty. They feel so small that you almost don't want to call attention to them. So it's things like being interrupted or spoken over, being mistaken for someone more junior, being the person that's expected to take the notes in the meeting or make the tea and coffee. So they're small things. They might feel uncomfortable to call out, but let's be clear, microaggressions erode people's confidence. They have a very corrosive impact when you're on the receiving end of them day in, day out, and they can undermine women's confidence and performance. Now, the data that you see on screen comes from the US, but we know that directionally this data is the same. The trends are the same in other parts of the world. This is from McKinsey and the Lean In organization, and they found, first of all, that 35% of women had experienced sexual harassment at some point in their careers, and almost 2/3 of heterosexual women, 71% of lesbian women, experience regular microaggressions in the workplace. So think about that for a moment. 1 in 3 women experience sexual harassment, and 2 in 3 women, at least, experience regular microaggressions in the workplace. So as much as we like to think that we've perhaps moved on from this, everyday sexism is unfortunately more prevalent than we like to think that it is. Now, if that's not bad enough, I'm going to now talk about the most significant barrier in the workplace for women, which is the broken rung. Now, this relates to the difficulty women face in making it to that all-important first rung of the career ladder, which is typically a first-line manager or supervisor role. So again, this is data from the US from the same study from McKinsey and Lean In that shows for every 100 men promoted to first-line manager role, only 72 women are promoted to first-line manager. So already at that first rung, women aren't getting to take the first step up. Now, if you apply an intersectional lens on this, and this again is a study from the US, so they looked at it through race, they found for every 100 men being promoted, only 58 Black women are promoted to that first rung of the career ladder. This is a huge differential. And I find this statistic quite shocking. The first rung of the ladder is a critical step because, let's face it, if you don't get to the first rung, you can't get beyond that to more senior roles. So this is a really critical step to opening up the number of women ultimately who will later on move into senior leadership roles. So in short, there's a combination of a lack of sponsorship, everyday sexism, a broken rung on the leadership ladder, which are collectively creating disproportionate barriers for women in the workplace. Now, I'd like to move on to the personal barriers. So we've talked about societal barriers, I've just covered the organisational barriers. Let's have a look at what's going on within women. So what's going on internally that might also be contributing to this differential in leadership. I'm going to start with confidence, which is a topic that comes up all the time. Women are less confident, I get told often and often. Women need to put themselves forward more. Women need to lean in. We hear this a lot, but let's have a look at what the evidence shows on this topic. Are women really needing to lean in? Now, this study on screen comes from a group of MBA students, but it has been replicated in many different industries and settings with the same results. So in this particular survey, the MBA students were asked how they thought they were performing against their peers. Now, 70% of the men thought they were performing better than their peers, whereas 70% of women thought they were performing about the same as their peers. And they can't both be right. Someone's over-egging it, someone's under-egging it. Maybe there's a bit of both going on, but statistically it doesn't add up. They can't both be right. Now, what this tells us that women aren't necessarily underconfident. Maybe they're more realistic about in the expression of their confidence, whereas men might be a bit overconfident in how they express themselves. Now, this is an important point because often confidence is confused for competence. So success is closely correlated with both competence and confidence. And how often do we see someone who's very confident and expresses themselves well, and part of us just assumes that they must be competent as well. So if we wrongly perceive women to be lacking in confidence, they're not really, they're just being more realistic, but if we perceive them to be lacking in confidence, maybe we also might assume they're lacking in competence as well. So there's something important here for all of us. I don't think this is about increasing women's confidence. I think this is about how we recalibrate how we interpret confidence, what it looks like. If we're used to seeing confidence expressed in a very overt way, that becomes our norm, and anything that doesn't match that looks underconfident. So let's just recalibrate how confidence is expressed by men and women and make sure we're interpreting that correctly. I want now to talk about the double bind. And this is a curious phenomenon which sees men and women being perceived very differently. So generally speaking, as a man progresses through his career, the more successful he is, the more likable, generally speaking, he's rated to be. So there's a positive correlation between success and likability. Whereas generally speaking, the more successful a woman is, the less likable she's rated to be. Now, interestingly, this rating is from both men and women. And the reason for this comes back to gender stereotypes once again. So the more we transgress those kind of very firmly entrenched societal norms that we all carry within us about how men and women ought to behave, the more we transgress those, so for example, by acting in ways that are more traditionally associated with men, like being assertive or being decisive or being driven or by being ambitious, for example, the more we transgress those, the more a woman will receive a backlash, a societal backlash, and it's coming in the form of lower likability. So women have a very narrow, acceptable range of operating behaviours that are available to them, which means that they're constantly walking a tightrope of you've got to be confident but not too confident that you get perceived as arrogant, or you need to be assertive but not too assertive that you come across as aggressive, or decisive but not so decisive that you come across as cold. And so this constant balancing act, this juggling of behaviours, can put a lot of women off of leadership roles. And so given this double bind is a result of both men and women's kind of views, I want to pause here for a moment and just talk about a phenomenon that is closely related to this called the queen bee syndrome. Maybe you've heard of it. It's the syndrome or the phenomenon where women who have made it to the top, maybe in very difficult circumstances, are less supportive to women younger and further down the career ladder than them. And it is a phenomenon that does exist. I've worked with queen bees in my lifetime. They certainly do exist. But increasingly, the research on this is tending to suggest that women are much more likely to pay it forward. Increasingly, we see study after study find that women are more likely to pull women up the career ladder with them and help them and give them support rather than take the ladder away for them. So I don't think the queen bee is necessarily what's behind this. It might be a small factor, but I don't think it accounts for all of this. Now, if we look at all the barriers I've been laying out for you, the implication of these is that it can lead to women taking a career or making a career sacrifice. Because let's face it, if you're constantly swimming against the tide, if you're constantly perceived as not so likable, if you're juggling an extra couple of hours every day in the house compared with your heterosexual partner, there comes a point where you say, it's just too much, I can't do it all. And so that leads to women working either beneath their potential or even opting out of the leadership pipeline altogether. Okay, so we've looked at societal barriers, organisational barriers, and personal barriers. And now I'd like to explore how these barriers impact women at the intersection of different layers of identity. So the term intersectionality, if you've not heard of it, explains the different layers of identity that we all have. So such as in this case, in addition to gender, might be ethnicity or age or parental status or sexual orientation or disability and so on. And how these layers of our identity overlap and influence our experiences, particularly when it comes to privilege and prejudice. So I know from our own research and research of others that this plays out in different ways. So let me give you a couple of examples. We know from our research that women with a disability face significant barriers in the workplace, some of the greatest barriers of all groups, actually. They experience more discrimination. The double bind, that tightrope of behaviours, is even more pronounced for women with a disability. And they report that they receive less development support from their line managers. And it's a very similar situation when you look at ethnicity. In our research, we used a UK sample and we found that Black women and Asian women experienced exactly the same barriers. They were enhanced. Discrimination was higher, the double bind was greater, and they perceived that they received less development support and sponsorship from senior leaders. We also found that women in the LGBT community, so bisexual and lesbian women, experienced a lot of discrimination and also had real pressures on that double bind, so that narrow range of operating behaviours. You can't stray too far from what's expected without being considerably penalised. But I want to finish with a group that perhaps experienced the most extreme discrimination of any group, and that is trans women. So in this case, the discrimination, the harassment is extreme, and it can even be physical and violent. They experience the most extreme discrimination, but they also experience a pay penalty. And this is a really interesting but also very disturbing finding. It's not from our research, it's from a small study that was done in the Netherlands. There aren't that many studies out there on the trans community on this topic, but this one is an interesting one. I caution to say it's small scale, so be careful in over-interpreting it, but it does lead to some very disturbing findings. It's worth holding on to these in our minds. So they found that women who identify, trans women that identify as a woman, but previously at some point in their lives had identified as a man, experience a pay penalty around 20%. So let's just put this into context. This person is the same person as they've always been. They've got the same experience in the workplace, the same skills, the same qualifications, kind of theoretically all the things that matter when it comes to pay, but they're paid 20% less than when they identified as a man. Now that's got to be about gender, right? Nothing else has changed in terms of the things that should matter. And we know this is a gendered issue because when you look at it from a trans men's experience, it's almost reversed. So a trans man who previously identified as a woman, on average, receives 8% more in his pay than when he identified as a woman. I'm going to pause here to let that sink in because I find this a deeply, deeply disturbing statistic. And if anything tells us that this is gendered, it is the experience of trans women and trans men. And so I worry about what this says about us as a society and what we value. So every woman will experience these barriers in a different way, and the more layers of intersectionality you have, the more likely you will experience these barriers more acutely and more profoundly. What about industry differences. I'm going to turn now to what goes on in different industries before we start talking about some solutions. So very quickly, I'm not going to go through all of this. I'm going to give you an opportunity to digest this later in the full report if you would like to. In our study, we looked at 7 industries, not every industry, but the 7 you can see on the screen. And here you can see the rank order of industries with the greatest barriers at the top. So the industries we found had the greatest barriers for women were energy and infrastructure, professional services, and manufacturing. But the reasons for these barriers are quite different. So in energy and infrastructure and manufacturing, it's about unconscious biases, gender stereotypes, it's about lack of development support from leadership. Whereas in professional services, the barriers are quite different actually. Here it's about juggling work demands and balancing that with home demands. And it's also about politics. So curiously, 37% of women in our study reported the politics, organisational politics were a big barrier for them in professional services. And that was much higher than other industries rated. So it's very interesting to see that the barriers are quite different by intersection. They're also quite different by industry, which means the solution to addressing them needs to take into account your local context. So who's in your workforce? What industry are you in, so that you are addressing the right barriers? Now, I hope, where does all this lead us? I hope I've made it really clear that this idea of meritocracy, an idea that we often hold on to very firmly in organisations, the sense that we'll be fairly rewarded for our endeavours, doesn't really exist. It is a myth, the myth of meritocracy. Different genders have very different experiences of the workplace. So what do we do about this? What is the answer to these really thorny and knotty issues? Well, I personally believe that this is an issue that can be solved, and it's up to each and every one of us to do something about it, to work together to solve that. And an important starting point is being clear on where the onus lies for solving this problem. So traditionally, we've seen a lot of emphasis on what's sometimes called the fixing women approach. So giving women more skills and confidence to navigate their careers. And there is a role that can play in the solution, but it is by no means the biggest role, the most important role, because there are clearly systemic and societal barriers that women alone can't solve. So my view is that we need to solve the problem at a societal level, an organisational level, and a personal level, and we need to do that in parallel. There's undoubtedly a role for government, but as we're all here from organisations today, I'm going to focus on what are the things that organisations can do, both kind of systemically, but also at an individual leadership level. And so I'm going to leave you with some tips, starting with what organisations can do at a structural level. So there are a few things here that are really important. There's probably about 20 things I would say really important, but I'm going to just point you to a couple of the more accessible and memorable points. Now, because of societal barriers, creating workplaces that are family friendly and which benefit everyone is a really important part of the solution. So some of the things that organisations can do, some of the things that we're seeing best practice organisations do in this space are start to design jobs flexibly as a default position. So rather than having the onus on the individual to apply for flexible working, which of course soon they'll be able to do in the UK from day one of employment, rather than doing that, organisations are starting to say, well, let's make jobs flexible by default, unless there is a good reason, a good business reason why a job can't be done flexibly. And of course, there are some industries where that won't work. I fully appreciate that in the services industry, for example. But for office-based jobs, a lot of organisations are saying, let's make them flexible by default. The other trend we're seeing around the world, and this is becoming a global trend, is equalising parental leave. So parental leave often is imbalanced. The mother gets the lion's share of it. The father might get a couple of weeks leave if he's lucky. We're seeing big multinational organisations start to equalise that. And there's a particular trend actually in financial services that we're seeing leading the charge on really equalising parental leave. So giving extended paid parental leave to mothers, to fathers, regardless of the circumstances of birth, whether it's IVF, natural birth, surrogacy, adoption, whatever, fostering. And so that is a definite trend that helps encourage more men to participate in the early stages of a child's life, and helps to make that create a balance at home for families who choose that. Now, the other things organisations can do is to start to dismantle gender stereotypes through allyship. So we're seeing organisations build skills in their leadership ranks around inclusive leadership. We're seeing a lot of inclusive leadership programs being rolled out, allyship, advocacy programs. We're also seeing an increase in ERGs, employee resource groups, to support minoritised genders. And the third thing organisations can do is create access to opportunities. So sponsorship programs, we run a lot of these programs ourselves for organisations, helping to match sponsors with women coming through the talent pipeline so that they can help to create some visibility, help to expand the network of these women. And there's also some interesting practices that we've seen in some organisations. So an example from Vodafone is some years ago, and this is even pre-pandemic, they put in place a formal rule where in conferences and events there needed to be a certain percentage of women present at events. So if there wasn't a natural, if women weren't naturally represented at that level, they would go to the next level down and invite more junior women to the event. That did two things. It helped to normalise what it would look and feel like at a conference. There would be more women there. And it also gave women who otherwise wouldn't ordinarily have access, it gave them access to networking and senior people, which is obviously helpful and beneficial to them. So there are some clever and simple things you can do to give opportunities and access to opportunities. I'm going to finish now with some thoughts on what we can do at an individual level. We're going to take some questions after this. But if I use the same three categories, what can every individual on this call do straight away at an individual level to start to affect positive change? And the first thing when it comes to creating family-friendly cultures, the first thing is just to watch when you're scheduling your meetings, watch the timing of your meetings. Don't set a meeting at a time that is likely to encroach on someone's family time or the school run time. It's particularly challenging when you're working across time zones, but keep it in mind. Or if you have to schedule a call, then mix it up so it's not the same person that's constantly being impacted. You can also normalise switching off. So there's a lot of talk about leaving loudly, leaving the office loudly at whatever time it is, 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, whenever it is, saying, I'm going home now, I'm going to pick up my child from school, I'm going to cook for dinner, I'm doing whatever I'm doing, and normalising this. This is particularly helpful when it comes from leaders. It's even more powerful when it comes from male leaders. The second thing you can do is to call out microaggressions and give women credit where it's due. So if you see a microaggression, or if you see a woman's idea being miscredited to someone else, you can call it out. You don't need to be aggressive. You don't need to create a scene. You can gently redirect and say, actually, I think that was Ellery's idea. Either way, I think it's a great idea. So just make sure the credit is being allocated fairly and equally. And the final thing is sponsorship. If you're a leader on this call and you're not already sponsoring at least one woman, this would be the one action I would ask you to go away and think about. How can you help one or more women in your organisation to raise their profile, raise their visibility, expand their network, help enhance their reputation? What can you do, either officially or unofficially, to affect that? Right. I'm going to close the session now. I know I want to make sure we've got time for some Q&A. I don't want you to feel despondent about the size of this challenge, because there is a lot of barriers that we've gone through. But actually, I think this problem is solvable. So I'm going to leave you with access here to a QR code. If you want to download the white paper that talks about these barriers in more detail, if you want to read more about them, you can. But meanwhile, Ellery, you've been keeping an eye on the Q&A box. I'm sure there's some questions in there. What's coming up?
I have. I think some people are struggling with the Q&A, so please, if you can't put questions into the Q&A, please do use the chat, and I'll try and navigate between the two. The first question I can see here is around So somebody shares your perspective that women without children may receive fewer promotions, but they're interested in understanding why this might be the case. Could it be related to societal perceptions and expectations about fitting a certain profile?
Yeah, look, it's a great question. And the honest answer is I don't know exactly why that is, but I certainly have some hypotheses of what I think it might be. And I do think it's exactly that. I think all of this comes back to gender stereotypes. So there is a gender expectation that women will be mothers, they'll be nurturing, they'll be caring. So I think in the UK, I think 82% of women will become mothers by the age of 45. I think in the US, it's something like 85% of women will become mothers by the age of 40, or it might not be quite that, but it's in that vicinity. The vast majority of women will become mothers. And so I think if you transgress this stereotype expectation, again, there's a social penalty. People kind of expect us to behave and to act and to live in certain ways. So I think gender stereotypes are probably at the heart of this, unfortunately. And that's why dismantling stereotypes and breaking them down and showing up in different ways is really important, so we can reset what the world looks like and should look like.
I totally agree, Sharon. I think it's societal norms are half the problem here. Another question, would you be able to clarify what the double burden is?
So the double burden is the burden between paid and unpaid work. So the paid work is your job, your career. The unpaid work is the amount of work you spend in the home on caring or domestic responsibilities. And that burden, it's a burden for women because the time in the home is greater. So the demands in the workplace for men and women are roughly the same, although our research found that women feel a pressure to work extra hours, maybe to prove themselves. But generally speaking, the workplace is demanding the same thing of women, but the home is expecting more of women than it is for men, at least in heterosexual relationships. And so that's why it is a burden for women.
Yeah, and I know you and I have spoken about this before, and we don't have time to go into it now, but the whole piece around the hidden load, the mental load that is often carried by the female. A question here from Pauline. How do we overcome the challenge of the decision makers still being the least diverse group who have the balance of power over all of this? That's a very good question.
It's a great question, Pauline. And of course, there's not a quick, simple answer I can give you in the remaining time, but I think it all starts with education. So kind of even being aware of some of the data that I've showed today is an important starting point, because there's often an assumption that we've kind of done gender equality, haven't we fixed it? We've been at this a long time. We've got other things we need to be focusing on now. And so kind of reminding people that we're not done yet, we're still 140 years away from gender parity in managerial roles around the world, is an important reminder that there is work to be done. I always think that there's something about kind of connecting with people at a personal level, connecting kind of at an emotional level. So I've talked about a lot of facts that speak to the head and the mind and the logical side of our brains, but there's also something about really understanding what this might mean for men in the organisation who have wives, sisters, daughters, mothers, female friends. How might it be for those important people in their lives? What might their experience be? And so connecting more emotionally can sometimes be a way of opening up the conversation.
Okay, and I'll very quickly, Sharon, if we can just tackle this one last question. Is there any research into what features, characteristics or other factors are identified in women who do progress in their careers?
Oh, gee. So the psychologist in me is feeling a kind of a debate in my own mind about kind of trait theory. So no, I don't think there is one template at all about what it takes, what characteristics or experiences or skills you need to progress. We see women of all different makeups and backgrounds and skill sets progressing. There's a couple of things that I think are important. I think it's really important to redefine what leadership looks like. We do a lot of women's development programs, and as part of those, we always encourage women to lead authentically. So don't go replicating the leadership styles you see around you. If they're not authentic to you, lead in your own way, because collectively, if we do that, we start to reshape leadership. So rather than, I'm turning your question on its head a bit, rather than what are the things you need to do, I would say let's redefine what good looks like and let's lead in our own way.
I totally agree, and I'm afraid I'm going to have to start to wrap up now. I'm so sorry to anyone's questions that we've not been able to get to. Very happy to pick up with you individually if you want to make contact, and Sharon and I will do our best to answer all your fabulous questions. I think the key thing here to take away, and certainly that I've taken away from Sharon's insights, are that gender equity isn't just a women's issue. We all need to proactively engage and advance this agenda. I think we need to reflect on the tips we've learned today and try and put one or two of these into practice. It's better to take action, even if it's imperfect, than not to take it at all. Thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you've enjoyed the webinar. Any feedback is welcomed. And thank you so much, Sharon, for your time and insight.
Thank you very much, everyone, for joining, and have a great rest of day.